Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. Out on the sun-scorched plains, a man's word is often the only currency he has. But what happens when that word is a lie? What happens when a hand offered in salvation becomes the very hand that tightens the shackle? Tonight's tale is about a young woman who placed her life in the hands of a stranger, only to have him sell her for 30 pieces of silver. But he made one fatal mistake. He left her alive. So gather round, folks, and listen to a story of betrayal at its most cruel, and a reckoning at its most cold. A story we call The Vulture's Price. The desert was a sea of shimmering, heat-blasted sand, and Clara was a castaway, adrift and sinking. She ran not with her feet, but with a raw, panicked desperation that had propelled her for 3 days and nights. Behind her lay the town of Redemption, a place whose name was now a bitter, ironic joke. She had fled with nothing but the clothes on her back, a near-empty canteen, and a secret that was a heavy, burning stone in her gut. The secret was the truth about what had happened to her father, the town's honest blacksmith, a man who had been murdered in his own forge. The town's powerful cattle baron, a man named Silas Thorne, had declared it a tragic accident. But Clara had seen it. Hidden in the hayloft, she had seen Thorne and his thugs beat her father to death. All because he had refused to sell his land, the last piece of the valley Thorne didn't own. The town sheriff, a man firmly in Thorne's pocket, had ruled it an accident, and the rest of the town, cowed by Thorne's power, had averted their eyes and accepted the lie. Clara, the sole witness, had become a liability, a loose thread that could unravel Thorne's entire tapestry of control. When she heard Thorne's men coming for her, she had fled into the one place she thought they wouldn't follow, the vast and forgiving expanse of the Sonora Desert. Now, that desert was killing her. Her canteen was empty, her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her vision was beginning to blur, the distant mesas wavering like ghosts on the horizon. She stumbled, her legs finally giving out, and collapsed into the scorching sand. The sun was a merciless hammer, and she was the anvil. She closed her eyes, a strange, weary peace settling over her. She would die here, and the secret would die with her. Thorne would win. It was the sound of a horse that brought her back from the edge of unconsciousness. A lone rider approached, a dark, wavering silhouette in the blinding glare. She fumbled for the small, single-shot derringer her father had insisted she carry, but her hands were clumsy, useless. The rider dismounted and stood over her, his long shadow a welcome, if menacing, eclipse of the sun. He was a tall, lean man dressed in the trail-worn, dusty clothes of a man who called no place home. His face was a mask of hard angles and sun-scorched leather, shadowed by the brim of a battered hat. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of a faded blue bandana, and they were as cold and as empty as the desert sky, yet they held a flicker of something she couldn't name and not pity, but a kind of weary, professional assessment. "You're a long way from anywhere, miss," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, the sound of a man who didn't waste words. "Water," she croaked, the word a painful scrape in her raw throat. Without a word, he unslung his canteen and knelt beside her, lifting her head gently and pouring a small, precious stream of water onto her lips. It was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. He let her drink her fill, then stood up. "Who's after you?" he asked. It wasn't a question of if, but of who. A lone woman did not end up in this part of the desert by accident. Clara hesitated, a lifetime of caution warring with her desperate need. She looked into his cold, impassive eyes. He was a gunslinger, a drifter, the kind of man her father had warned her about. But he had also just saved her life. In this land where trust was a commodity more precious than gold, she had to make a choice. "Silas Thorne," she whispered, "from Redemption. He killed my father." The man's expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker of recognition at the name. He knew of Redemption. He knew of Thorne. "Thorne's a powerful man," he said, a statement of fact, not a judgment. "He's put a price on you. $500. Dead or alive." The words hit her like a physical blow. $500. That was the price of her life, the price of her silence. "You're going to take me back, then?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, the small hope that had flickered within her dying. The man was silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her ragged dress, her blistered face, and the defiant, terrified spark in her eyes. He looked out at the vast, empty desert, as if weighing her life against the promise of the gold. "My name is Reed," he said finally, turning his gaze back to her. He reached down and, with a surprising gentleness, helped her to her feet. "And I don't work for Silas Thorne." He gestured to his horse. "I'm heading for the border. You can ride with me. I'll see you get there safely." The relief that washed over Clara was so profound it almost buckled her knees. He was a stranger, a man with cold eyes and a gun on his hip. But he had a conscience. He was her savior, a guardian angel who had appeared out of the blinding sun. She had been saved. She trusted him. In the desperate calculus of survival, she had no other choice. He helped her onto his horse, then swung up behind her. As they rode away, leaving her near grave to be reclaimed by the wind, Clara leaned back against the solid, steady presence of the man named Reed. She felt a profound, if fragile, sense of safety. She was no longer alone. She had found a protector, a man who would help her carry the weight of her terrible secret. She did not know, could not have known, that she had just placed her life, her trust, and her very soul into the hands of a man whose conscience had been sold long ago. And that this journey was not a flight to safety, but a slow, deliberate march to the auction block. The promise he had made was just a whisper in the dust, as empty and as treacherous as the desert itself. The journey with Reed was a masterclass in the harsh and sentimental education of the desert. He was not a gentle protector, but a pragmatic and efficient survivalist. He pushed them hard during the cooler hours of the early morning and late evening, and they rested during the brutal, white-hot tyranny of the midday sun. He was a man of few words, his silence as vast and as profound as the landscape they traveled through. But in that silence, Clara began to build a foundation of trust. She saw it in the small things. She saw it in the way he always gave her the first drink from the canteen, the way he would take the longer, more arduous night watch, allowing her to get a few hours of precious, fitful sleep. She saw it in the quiet competence with which he navigated the seemingly featureless terrain, finding hidden springs and pockets of shade that meant the difference between life and death. He was a man who understood the brutal calculus of survival, and he had included her in his equation. Their conversations, when they happened, were brief and practical, centered on their immediate needs: water, food, shelter. But slowly, tentatively, Clara began to open up. In the flickering, intimate light of a small campfire, surrounded by a universe of oppressive darkness and a billion cold, indifferent stars, she began to tell him her story. She told him about her father, about his kindness and his unshakable integrity. She described the way Silas Thorne had slowly squeezed the life out of the town of Redemption, buying up land, corrupting the law, and crushing anyone who stood in his way. And then, her voice dropping to a choked, painful whisper, she told him what she had seen from the hayloft: the argument, the brutal, senseless beating, the murder. Reed listened, his face an unreadable mask in the firelight. He didn't offer words of comfort or sympathy. He simply listened, his pale blue eyes fixed on her, absorbing every detail. When she was finished, a long silence fell between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the distant, lonely howl of a coyote. "Thorne can't afford a witness," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "That's why the bounty is so high. It's not just about silencing you. It's about sending a message." "What kind of message?" she asked. "That what Thorne owns, he keeps," Reed replied, his gaze distant. "And that includes the truth." A few days later, they had their first encounter with the dangers that were hunting them. They had taken shelter for the night in a small, rocky canyon when Reed, with the preternatural senses of a wild animal, suddenly held up a hand for silence. He had heard something on the wind, the faint clink of a shod horse on rock. He moved with a silent, deadly grace, melting into the shadows, a pistol appearing in his hand as if by magic. He gestured for Clara to stay hidden. She crouched behind a boulder, her heart hammering against her ribs, clutching her own small derringer. Two riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon, their forms dark silhouettes against the moonlit sky. They were bounty hunters, drawn by the lure of Thorne's gold. They were hard, ugly-looking men, their faces etched with the casual cruelty of their trade. "I tell you, I saw their tracks," one of them said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "A single horse, riding heavy. It's them." "Let's go in," the other said, pulling his gun. $500 is a lot of money for one little girl. They never got the chance. From the darkness, Reed's voice, as cold and as final as a tombstone, cut through the night. Turn around. Right away. And forget you ever saw this canyon. The two men froze, their heads snapping toward the sound of his voice, their guns coming up. But they were firing at a ghost. Reed was no longer where his voice had come from. A gunshot roared from a different part of the canyon, from their flank. One of the bounty hunters cried out, clutching his arm as his pistol clattered to the ground. Before the other could react, Reed was on him. He seemed to materialize from the very rocks, a whirlwind of violence. There was a brief, brutal struggle, the sound of a fist hitting bone, and the second man collapsed. Reed stood over the two groaning, wounded men. He didn't kill them. He disarmed them, took their spare canteens and a pouch of ammunition, and then, with a cold, final warning, sent them on their way. Tell anyone you see that the girl is under my protection, he said, his voice a low, deadly promise. And tell Silas Thorne that if he wants her, he can come and get her himself. As they watched the two bounty hunters retreat into the darkness, Clara felt a profound sense of awe and gratitude. This man, this silent, cold-eyed stranger, was her protector. He was a formidable, dangerous man, but his danger was now her shield. She had been right to trust him. He was a man with a conscience, a man who, for reasons of his own, had chosen to stand against the injustice of a tyrant like Thorne. The incident seemed to change something between them. A new, fragile intimacy began to grow. Reed remained a man of few words, but his silences now seemed less about cold detachment and more about a deep, internal sorrow. Clara would catch him sometimes, staring out at the horizon, his face a mask of such profound, weary sadness that her heart ached for him. She began to see not a cold-blooded killer, but a man haunted by his own past, a man who was perhaps seeking his own form of redemption and protecting her. She began to fall in love with him, not with the fiery, passionate love of a young girl's dreams, but with the desperate, grateful love of a survivor for her rescuer. He was the only solid thing in a world that had crumbled to dust around her. She began to dream of a future, a life after the desert, after Thorne. A life, perhaps, with this quiet, sad-eyed man. She did not know that Reed was haunted not by a past he was running from, but by a debt he was riding toward. She did not know that his every act of protection, every shared moment of quiet companionship, was a lie. He was not protecting her from the vultures. He was simply fattening her up for a different, more patient predator. His shadow, which she had seen as a shield, was in fact the shadow of the vulture's wing, circling, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The border town of Dos Hermanas Three Sisters was a festering sore on the lip of the U.S.-Mexico border. It was a place where the law was a distant rumor and survival was a commodity traded for in blood, bullets, or coin. The air was a thick, foul stew of cheap tequila, and washed bodies, and the ever-present, choking dust of the Chihuahua Desert. It was a haven for the desperate, the damned, and the depraved. It was the place Reed had been riding toward all along. They rode into town in the late afternoon, the setting sun painting the dusty adobe buildings in hues of blood and rust. The town was even more lawless and menacing than Clara had imagined. Hard-faced men with guns on their hips watched them from the shadowed doorways of saloons and cantinas, their eyes like those of hungry wolves, sizing up a new piece of meat. "We'll get a room here for the night," Reed said, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. "Get a hot meal. In the morning, we cross the border. You'll be safe in Mexico. Thorne's reach doesn't extend that far." His words were a balm to her frayed nerves. They were at the end of their journey. The nightmare was almost over. He led them to the largest, most raucous saloon in town, Al Nido del Bitri, the Vulture's Nest. The name sent a small, involuntary shiver down Clara's spine. The inside of the saloon was a cavern of noise, smoke, and menace. Out-of-tune piano banged away in a corner, and the room was filled with the kind of men whose faces belonged on wanted posters. "Wait here," Reed said, gesturing to a small, relatively clean table in a corner. "I'll get us a room and some food." He walked to the bar, a tall, commanding presence that moved through the human filth with an easy, confident authority. Clara watched him go, a swell of affection and gratitude in her heart. He was her rock, her savior. She had placed her life in his hands, and he had carried her safely through the fire. She watched as he spoke to the bartender, a hulking, scarred man who looked more like a butcher than a purveyor of drinks. The bartender nodded and gestured toward a dark, beaded doorway at the back of the saloon. Reed nodded and disappeared through it. He was gone for a long time. Clara waited, and knew, unfamiliar anxiety beginning to creep in. The stares of the men in the saloon were becoming more overt, more predatory. She felt exposed, vulnerable. She kept her hand near the small derringer hidden in her skirt pocket. When Reed finally returned, his face was as impassive as ever, but there was a new, hard glint in his eyes. He was not carrying a room key or a plate of food. He was followed by two of the largest, ugliest men Clara had ever seen. They were members of a notorious border gang known as the Coyoteros, men who specialized in smuggling, kidnapping, and murder. Their leader, a man known as El Martillo the Hammer, was said to be the most ruthless man on the border. "What's going on, Reed?" Clara asked, her voice trembling, as the two thugs positioned themselves behind her, blocking any chance of escape. Reed did not look at her. He looked at a spot on the wall just above her head. He placed a heavy leather pouch on the table. It landed with the solid, unmistakable clink of gold coins. "There's been a change of plans," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. The blood drained from Clara's face. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. "No," she whispered, the word a small, broken thing. "Reed, no." $500 was the price, Reed said, his voice as cold and as empty as the desert sky. "But El Martillo, he's a collector of rare things. He offered 1,000. He finally met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw not a flicker of remorse, not a hint of the man she thought she knew. She saw only the cold, dead calculation of a merchant who had just sold a piece of livestock for a good price. It was just business, Clara. The betrayal was so absolute, so profound, that it was like a physical blow. It knocked the air from her lungs, shattered her world into a million pieces. The kindness, the protection, the shared moments by the firelight had all been a lie. A long, cruel, elaborate performance designed to lead her here, to this moment. He had not been her savior. He had been her captor all along, a patient wolf in the sheep's clothing of a guardian. The two thugs grabbed her arms, their grips like iron bands. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She was paralyzed by a grief and a shock so deep it transcended any other emotion. She just stared at Reed, at the men she had trusted, at the men she had begun to love, as he picked up the pouch of gold. "You're a monster," she whispered, her voice a dead, hollow thing. Reed paused, his hand on the pouch. For the first time, a flicker of something. Was it regret? Was it shame? Crossed his face. Then it was gone, replaced by the hard, empty mask she had first seen in the desert. "Out here," he said, his voice a low growl, "you're either the butcher or the cattle. I made my choice a long time ago." He turned and walked away without a backward glance, the pouch of gold in his hand. He did not look back as the two men dragged her through the beaded doorway, into the darkness, into the hands of the monsters he had just sold her to. He just kept walking, melting into the crowd of the saloon, the 30 pieces of silver and then some his reward for the ultimate act of treason. The promise made in the dust had been a lie, and the vulture's nest was now Clara's cage. The darkness behind the beaded curtain was a physical thing, a foul, suffocating blackness that smelled of stale tequila, and washed bodies, and fear. Clara was dragged down a short, narrow hallway and thrown into a small, windowless storeroom. The heavy wooden door slammed shut, and the bolt slid home with a sound of absolute finality. She was a piece of property, delivered and stored. She lay on the hard-packed dirt floor, the shock of Reed's betrayal a numbing, paralyzing poison. Her mind replayed every moment of their journey together, his gentle hands giving her water, his calm voice in the darkness of the canyon, the shared, quiet moments that had felt so real. It had all been a lie, a cruel and intricate performance. The man she had trusted with her life, the man she had allowed into the fragile, wounded chambers of her heart, had been a phantom. The real man was the one who had walked away with a bag of gold, leaving her to the wolves. The grief was a physical, tearing pain. But beneath the grief, a new and terrible emotion began to smolder. A cold, hard, and utterly pure hatred. It was a hatred for Reed, for his treachery, for the way he had used her hope and her trust as tools of his trade. And it was a hatred for the men who now owned her, for the world that allowed such evil to exist. She did not lie there and weep for long. The daughter of the redemption blacksmith, the girl who had survived 3 days in the desert, was not a creature of passive despair. Her grief began to crystallize, to harden into a diamond-sharp resolve. She would not die here. She would not be the broken plaything of a Borderlands thug. And she would not allow Reed to live out his life with the price of her soul in his pocket. In the absolute darkness of that small, filthy room, Clara made an oath. It was not a prayer to a benevolent God, but a promise to the darkest, most resilient part of her own spirit. She swore that she would survive this. She swore that she would escape. And she swore, with a cold and terrible certainty, that she would hunt down the man named Reed and she would make him pay for his betrayal, not with gold, but with blood. Her chance to begin her own education and survival came a few hours later. The door was unbarred, and in the flickering torchlight of the hallway stood a man who could only be El Martillo. He was a mountain of a man, his face a landscape of scars, his eyes small, black, and devoid of any light. He held a plate of greasy food and a tin cup of water in one hand, and a coiled leather whip in the other. "So," he rumbled, his voice a gravelly mix of Spanish and broken English, "you are the little bird that is worth $1,000. Let us see if you can be taught to sing." He set the food and water down, then took a menacing step toward her. Clara scrambled back until she hit the far wall. This was the moment. She could cower and accept her fate as a victim, or she could fight back and begin her new life as a survivor. She chose to fight. As he lunged for her, she kicked out with all her strength, her boot connecting solidly with his knee. The big man grunted in surprised pain, his lunge faltering for a split second. It was all the time she needed. She grabbed the tin cup of water and threw its contents directly into his face. Blinded and sputtering, he roared in rage and swung the whip wildly. Clara dropped to the floor, the leather cracking in the air just above her head. She scrambled for the plate of food, not for the sustenance, but for the crude tin fork that lay upon it. She closed her hand around it, the tines pressing into her palm. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all she had. El Martillo wiped the water from his eyes, his face a mask of pure, murderous fury. He raised the whip again. "You will learn respect, little bird," he snarled. As the whip came down, she did not cower. She lunged forward, under the arc of the whip, and drove the fork with all the force of her desperate, raging spirit into his thick thigh. The scream he let out was not one of rage, but of pure, agonized pain. He dropped the whip and staggered back, clutching his leg, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. No one had ever dared to fight back against El Martillo. He backhanded her then, a blow of such brutal force that it sent her sprawling, her head cracking against the adobe wall. The world exploded into a shower of stars, and she slid into unconsciousness. But she had won. She had hurt him. She had shown him, and more importantly, she had shown herself, that she was not a helpless piece of property. She was a fighter. Over the next few days, her life became a grim cycle of defiance and punishment. El Martillo, his pride wounded as much as his leg, seemed to take a sadistic pleasure in trying to break her. He would have her beaten. He would deprive her of food and water. But he did not try to rape her. Her initial, feral act of defiance had planted a seed of caution in his mind. This one was not a lamb, she was a cornered wildcat, and he was wary of her claws. Clara endured. With each blow, her resolve hardened. With each day of starvation, her hatred became more focused. She was a student in a brutal and forgiving school, and she was learning quickly. She learned to read the moods of her captors. She learned to identify their weaknesses, the way one guard was always drunk, the way another was afraid of snakes. Her mind, which had once been filled with dreams of a peaceful life, was now a cold, analytical machine, constantly searching for a way out. The rumors began to trickle out from the vulture's nest, whispers carried by the saloon girls and the terrified servants. They spoke of the $1,000 girl who was being held in the back room, the one who had stabbed El Martillo, the one he could not seem to break. Her chance finally came after a week of captivity. El Martillo, his leg now festering with a nasty infection, had to make a trip to a larger town to see a real doctor. He left his gang in charge, with strict instructions to keep the girl under lock and key. But his absence created a power vacuum, and the gang, a collection of brutish and disciplined thugs, grew lax. The drunken guard became even drunker. That night, Clara put her plan into action. Using a piece of wire she had painstakingly pried from her cot, she worked on the crude lock of her cell door. It took hours, her fingers ran bleeding, but just before dawn, she heard the satisfying click of the tumblers falling into place. She slipped from the room, ghost in the silent, sleeping building. She made her way to the gang's main room, where they slept in a drunken stupor. She did not just flee. The oath she had made in the darkness demanded more than that. It demanded a message. She took the drunken guard's own rope from his belt. She moved to the most vicious of her tormentors, a man who had taken particular pleasure in beating her. With a cold, methodical precision, she looped the rope around his neck and, using the skills of leverage her blacksmith father had taught her, she strangled him in his sleep. She took his gun, his horse, and a bag of supplies, and she rode out after her Monas, not as a fleeing victim, but as a predator leaving her first kill. She was no longer Clara, the blacksmith's daughter. That girl had died in the desert, betrayed by a man with cold, blue eyes. The woman who rode into the pre-dawn darkness was someone new, someone hard, someone who had been forged in the crucible of betrayal and brutality. And she had an oath to fulfill. Her hunt for Reed had just begun. The desert that had almost been Clara's grave now became her sanctuary. She rode hard for 2 days, pushing the stolen horse to its limit, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the vulture's nest. She was no longer a lost and desperate castaway, but a woman with a singular, all-consuming purpose. The skills Reed had taught her, the harsh lessons of survival he had so patiently imparted, were now the very tools she would use to hunt him. It was a bitter, terrible irony, and it fueled the cold fire of her rage. She did not ride aimlessly. She knew she could not simply track Reed. He was a ghost, a man who knew how to disappear. To find him, she needed to understand him. She needed to know the world he inhabited, the dark, violent underbelly of the West where men were bought and sold. She needed an education, and she knew the only place to get it was in the lion's den. She turned her horse north, back toward the territory she had fled, back toward redemption. Her return to the town that had betrayed her was a quiet, ghostly affair. She did not ride down the main street in the light of day. She slipped into town after dark, a shadowy figure on a stolen horse. The town wasn't changed, still suffocating under the thumb of Silas Thorne. But Clara was no longer the frightened girl who had fled from it. She was a different creature now, her eyes hard and watchful, her hand resting with a new, grim familiarity on the butt of the pistol she had taken from her captor. She did not seek out her old friends. To do so would be to endanger them. Instead, she sought out the town's shadows, the people who lived on the fringes, the ones who saw and heard everything, but were loyal to no one but themselves. Her first stop was the small, dilapidated shack of One-Eyed Jack, an old, grizzled prospector who had lost his eye in a card game and his faith in humanity long before that. He had been a friend of her father's, one of the few men who had quietly offered his condolences and then warned her to run. She found him on his porch, rocking slowly in the moonlight, a jug of cheap whiskey his only companion. He looked up as she approached, and his one good eye widened in disbelief. "Clara girl," he rasped, his voice a gravelly whisper. "By all that's holy. They said you were dead, swallowed by the desert. The desert spits out what it can't digest, Jack," she said, her voice a low, hard thing that he didn't recognize. "I need your help." She told him a part of her story, not the intimate, painful details of Reed's betrayal, but the simple, brutal facts of her capture and escape. She told him she was not seeking to reclaim her father's land, but to hunt the men who had wronged her. "That's a fool's errand, girl," he said, taking a long pull from his jug. "You can't take on the whole damn world." "I'm not," she said, her voice as cold and as sharp as a shard of ice. "I'm just hunting one man, a drifter named Reed. I need to know where men like him go, where they get their jobs, who they work for, where they hide." One-Eyed Jack stared at her for a long time, at the new, hard set of her jaw and the terrifying, empty stillness in her eyes. He saw that the blacksmith's daughter was gone, and in her place was something that was both frightening and strangely admirable. Men like that, he said slowly. They follow the scent of blood and money. They work for men like Thorn. Or men even worse. They drift between the boom towns, the railroad camps, the border hellholes. They're ghosts. The only way to find a ghost is to become one yourself. He became her unwilling mentor in the dark arts of the Western underworld. He taught her how to listen, how to read the subtle currents of information that flowed through a saloon. He taught her about the different gangs, the bounty hunter networks, the unwritten codes of the men who lived outside the law. Clara was a quick study. She cut her long, beautiful hair, trading her dress for the practical, anonymous garb of a young man: breeches, a worn shirt, and a dusty hat pulled low. She practiced with her pistol until her hand was steady and her aim was true. The loud report of the gun was a comforting, empowering sound, a stark contrast to the silent, helpless terror she had felt enters her manas. Her first test, her first step into the world of the hunter, came a few weeks later. A rumor reached them of a small group of Silas Thorne's men who were shaking down farmers in a neighboring valley. They were led by a particularly nasty piece of work, a man who had been part of the group that had murdered her father. Clara did not plan a direct assault. She used her mind, her knowledge of the terrain, and the new, cold cunning she was developing. She learned their route and, with Jack's help, prepared an ambush. It was a simple, brutal plan. They created a small rock slide, blocking a narrow trail. When the three thugs were bunched up and confused, Clara, hidden in the rocks above, opened fire. She did not hesitate. The first shot took a man's horse out from under him. The second caught another in the shoulder. The third man, seeing his companions fall, threw down his gun and begged for his life. Clara and Jack came down from the rocks. Clara walked up to the groaning, wounded man, the one who had been at the forge that terrible day. She looked down at him, her face an unreadable mask. "Remember me?" she asked. The man's eyes widened in terrified recognition. "The blacksmith's girl." "That girl is dead," Clara said. "You helped kill her." She did not kill them. Her oath was not about random vengeance. It was a specific, personal debt to be collected from one man. She tied them up, took their guns and their money, and left them for the local sheriff to find, along with an anonymous note detailing their crimes. But before she left, she took the leader's own rope from his saddle. She tied it into a hangman's noose and left it hanging from the branch of a tree above them, a silent, chilling message. The story of the ambush, and of the signature noose, spread like wildfire. They didn't know who was responsible. They called the mysterious attacker the Ghost of Redemption, a phantom who was striking back at Thorne's empire. Silas Thorne, enraged and unnerved, put a new, higher bounty on the head of this mysterious ghost, never dreaming it was the very girl he had driven into the desert. Clara, with her share of the outlaw's money, was now equipped to begin her real hunt. She had a new horse, new supplies, and a new, hard-won education in the ways of the world. She said her farewells to One-Eyed Jack. "Be careful, girl," the old man said, his one eye filled with a worried concern. "This path you're on, it don't have many happy endings." "I'm not looking for a happy ending, Jack," Clara replied, swinging into her saddle. "I'm just looking for an ending." She rode out of redemption, not as a fleeing victim, but as a predator on the trail. She was a ghost, a legend in the making, and she was hunting for a man with cold, blue eyes. She would follow the scent of blood and money, and she would not stop until she found him. Clara's hunt for Reed was a journey through the circles of a sun-scorched hell. She moved through the West's dark underbelly, a world of transient railroad camps, lawless mining towns, and smoke-filled gambling dens where a man's life could be won or lost on the turn of a card. She was a ghost in this world, her boyish disguise and quiet, watchful nature allowing her to move unnoticed through places where a woman alone would have been devoured. She was following the trail of a lie, the whispers and rumors that Reed's betrayal had left in its wake. She learned that the story he had sold along with her was that she was a wanted murderer, a dangerous and unstable woman, and that his delivery of her to Al Martillo had been an act of a brave, law-abiding citizen. Reed had not just sold her body, he had murdered her name, turning her into the villain of a story he had authored. This knowledge only hardened her resolve, turning her quest for vengeance into a quest to reclaim the very truth of her own existence. Her method was one of patience and observation. She would ride into a new town, take a low-paying, anonymous job mucking out a stable, washing dishes in a saloon, and she would listen. She would listen to the bragging of bounty hunters, the gossip of prostitutes, the drunken ramblings of outlaws. She was looking for a pattern, a mention of a tall, quiet gunslinger with cold, blue eyes, a man known for his skill with a gun and his lack of a conscience. The trail was cold and frustrating. Reed was a professional drifter, a man who knew how to cover his tracks. But Clara was a relentless hunter. She learned to read the signs, to connect the dots. A story in a Colorado mining town of a lone gunman who had collected a bounty on a wanted man and then disappeared. A whisper in a Nebraska cattle town of a quiet stranger who had won a small fortune at a poker table and had ridden out before sunrise. Each story was a breadcrumb, a faint scent of the man she was hunting. Her journey was also a continuing education in the brutal realities of the world she now inhabited. She saw firsthand the casual cruelty, the rampant injustice, the way the powerful preyed upon the weak. And she found that she could not always just be a passive observer. The blacksmith's daughter, the girl who had been raised to believe in right and wrong, was not entirely dead. In a muddy, desperate town in the Wyoming Territory, she saw a young saloon girl being brutally beaten by a drunken cattle baron. The local sheriff, paid to look the other way, did nothing. Clara, who had been washing dishes in the kitchen, saw the girl's terrified eyes, and she saw a reflection of her own past, of her own helplessness in the vulture's nest. That night, she waited for the cattle baron in the alley behind the saloon. She did not confront him with a gun. She used a heavy iron skillet from the kitchen, the same tool she had used against the guard at El Martillo's stable. The fight was short, brutal, and silent. She left the man in a broken, unconscious heap, his gun and his fat purse now her own. She slipped half the money under the door of the saloon girl's room and was gone from the town before dawn. She was becoming something more than an avenger. She was becoming a strange, anonymous agent of justice, a ghost who would occasionally, and violently, right a small wrong in a world that was filled with them. Each act was a small rebellion against the world that Reed and his kind had created. Her big break came in a town called Dust Devil's End, a place so remote and God-forsaken that it felt like the last stop before hell. It was here that she heard a name from her past, El Martillo. She learned that the brutish gang leader, his legs still bothering him from the souvenir she had left him, had put a bounty out on her head. The story was that a treacherous whore had stabbed him, killed one of his men, and stolen his horse. He wanted her back, alive, so he could have the pleasure of skinning her himself. But the more interesting piece of information was that El Martillo had also put a blood bounty on the man who had sold her to him. Reed, it seemed, had broken a cardinal rule of the underworld. He had sold damaged goods. The girl he had promised was a meek and broken thing had turned out to be a wildcat who had brought chaos and humiliation upon El Martillo's gang. In their twisted code of honor, this was a betrayal. Reed had made a powerful new enemy. Clara now had an unlikely and unwitting ally. She realized that she could use El Martillo's network of informants and bounty hunters to help her find Reed. She began to deliberately cross the paths of men she knew to be in El Martillo's employ. She would let herself be seen, a fleeting glimpse of the boy who matched the description of the mysterious ghost of redemption, then disappear, leaving a tantalizingly fresh trail. She was leading them, drawing them, using their hunt for her as a way to flush out her own quarry. It was a dangerous, high-stakes game. She was now being hunted by two powerful forces, the agents of Silas Thorne, who wanted to silence the witness, and the thugs of El Martillo, who wanted revenge. And all of them, in their search for her, were inadvertently helping her search for Reed. The trail finally grew hot in the lawless expanse of the New Mexico Territory. She heard a story of a tall, blue-eyed gunslinger who had recently signed on with a notorious outlaw named Black Bart, a man known for his daring train robberies. The description matched Reed perfectly, and the location of Black Bart's rumored hideout was a place called Diablo Canyon. Clara rode toward Diablo Canyon, a sense of grim, final purpose settling over her. The long, cold trail was coming to an end. She was no longer just the hunter. She was about to walk deliberately into the lion's den, into a place filled with the most dangerous men in the territory. But she was not the same girl who had collapsed in the desert. She was a survivor, a fighter, a ghost who had learned to hunt in the darkness. And she was finally closing in on the man who had created her. Diablo Canyon was a jagged scar carved into the face of the earth, a place of twisted rock formations and deep, permanent shadows where the sun never reached. It was a natural fortress, the perfect hideout for a man like Black Bart and his gang of train robbers. To ride into Diablo Canyon was to voluntarily enter your own tomb. Clara did not ride in. She approached the canyon with the caution and patience of a seasoned predator. For 3 days, she scouted the perimeter from the high ridges, her small spyglass her only companion. She was a ghost in the rocks, watching the comings and goings of the outlaws, learning the rhythm of their camp, the positions of their sentries. The outlaw camp was a small, chaotic settlement of tents and lean-tos, nestled in a box canyon at the heart of the complex. There were a dozen men, a rough, brutal-looking collection of the West's most wanted. And among them, she saw him. Reed. He was unchanged. He still had the same cold, impassive stillness, the same weary set to his shoulders. He was a man apart, even among these other outcasts. He took no part in their boisterous, drunken card games. He simply sat by himself, cleaning his weapons, his pale blue eyes constantly scanning the canyon walls. He was a man who was always expecting a threat, always on guard. He was about to be proven right. Clara knew that a direct assault was suicide. She was one woman against a dozen hardened killers. She had to use her mind, the cunning she had so painfully acquired. She had to turn the outlaws' strength, their numbers, and their isolation into a weakness. Her plan was one of psychological warfare, a strategy designed to light a fuse and let the bomb destroy itself. The key to her plan was the outlaws' greed. She had learned that they had recently pulled off a major robbery, stealing a Union Pacific payroll shipment. The gold, a fortune that was the only thing holding this disparate group of killers together, was the heart of their operation. She would attack the heart. On the 4th night, under the cover of a brewing thunderstorm, she made her move. She slipped past the lone, inattentive sentry at the canyon's entrance, her movements as silent as the falling rain. She did not go to the main camp. She went to the small, heavily guarded cave where she had seen them store their supplies in the heavy, iron-bound payroll box. The cave was guarded by 2 men. She did not try to fight them. She used the storm, and a tactic she had learned from One-Eyed Jack. She had captured a rattlesnake earlier that day, a large, angry diamondback. As a flash of lightning illuminated the canyon, she tossed the burlap sack containing the snake near the entrance of the cave. The guards, startled by the sudden, furious rattling, turned their attention to the immediate, deadly threat. In that moment of distraction, Clara, who had circled around, slipped into the cave from a small, secondary opening she had spotted from the ridge. She did not try to steal the heavy payroll box. She had a different plan. She opened the box, her hands working quickly, and took a single, heavy canvas bag of gold coins. Then, from her own saddlebag, she produced a small but heavy pouch filled with worthless iron pyritfuls gold which she placed into the payroll box to approximate the weight of the stolen gold. She also left something else, a single, unique, silver concho, one she had deliberately taken from the hatband of one of El Martillo's men during a previous encounter. She slipped back out of the cave as silently as she had entered, the bag of real gold now in her possession. The next morning, the theft was discovered. Black Bart, a man known for his explosive temper, flew into a rage. He saw the single bag of gold missing, felt the weight of the box, and saw the fool's gold. But most importantly, he saw the silver concho. He recognized it instantly as the mark of El Martillo's gang. "That son of a bitch," he roared. "El Martillo is moving on our territory. He's trying to steal our score." The seed of paranoia was planted. Black Bart, a man who trusted no one, immediately suspected a traitor in his own camp. Who had been on watch? Who had been talking to strangers in the last town they'd visited? His angry, accusatory gaze fell upon the newest member of his gang, the quiet, aloof gunslinger who had joined them just a month ago. "You?" he snarled, pointing a finger at Reed. "You were on the border. You know all Martillo's men. This stinks of an inside job." Reed looked at him, his face a mask of cold denial. "You're a fool, Bart. If I were going to steal your gold, I'd take all of it, and you'd be dead." But the poison of suspicion was already working. The other outlaws, their share of the fortune now in jeopardy, began to look at Reed with narrowed, hostile eyes. The fragile alliance that held the gang together began to crumble. Clara, watching from the ridge, now played her final card. She took the stolen bag of gold and, waiting for a patrol of 3 of Bart's men to ride out, she staged an ambush. She didn't attack them. She simply fired a few shots from a distance, then left the bag of gold in a conspicuous place on the trail, as if the ambusher had been scared off and had dropped it in their haste. When the patrol returned with the recovered gold, the camp was thrown into further chaos. The story they told was of a single, phantom shooter, a ghost in the rocks. It was a setup, one of Bart's lieutenants yelled. Someone in camp tipped off the ambusher. They were trying to get that gold out on their own. The accusation was now out in the open. The camp devolved into a paranoid, armed standoff, every man looking at his partner as a potential traitor. Fights broke out. The fragile trust that had bound them together was completely shattered. In the midst of this chaos, Reed, a man who had lived his life by a simple code of self-preservation, knew it was time to leave. He was being set up, and a gang that was turning on itself was a sinking ship. He packed his meager belongings and prepared to slip away in the confusion. But Clara had anticipated this. She was not in the rocks anymore. She had made her way down into the canyon, into the labyrinth of gullies and arroyos that fed into the main camp. She was no longer trying to destroy the gang. She had already accomplished that. She was now just hunting for one man. As Reed led his horse through a narrow, secluded arroyo, the only unguarded escape route from the canyon, he found his path blocked. Clara stood there, 20 yards away, a pistol in her hand, her face shadowed by the brim of her hat. Reed stopped, his hand hovering over the butt of his own gun. He stared at her, at the boyish clothes, the short hair. He didn't recognize her at first. And then, his eyes met hers, and he saw the ghost of the blacksmith's daughter, the girl he had sold for a bag of gold. A look of slow, dawning, utter disbelief crossed his face. "Clara," he breathed. "Hello, Reed," she said, and her voice was a thing of ice and stone, a sound he had never heard before. "Remember me? It's time to settle our account." The Devil's Canyon had become their personal courtroom, and the final, bloody trial was about to begin. The silence in the narrow arroyo was a profound and heavy thing, broken only by the low moan of the wind and the nervous stamping of Reed's horse. He stood frozen, his mind struggling to reconcile the ragged, hard-eyed figure before him with the memory of the desperate, frightened girl he had left in the vulture's nest. The transformation was so complete, so absolute. It was as if he were facing a ghost, a vengeful spirit summoned from the desert sands. "This isn't possible," he finally managed to say, his voice a dry rasp. "You're dead, El Martillo." "El Martillo made a bad investment," Clara said, her voice devoid of any emotion. The pistol in her hand did not waver. "And you, Reed, you have a talent for selling damaged goods. It seems you've made enemies on both sides of the border." A flicker of understanding, followed by a cold, professional respect, dawned in Reed's eyes. He finally understood the chaos that had consumed Black Bart's camp. The snake, the fool's gold, the phantom shooter, it had all been her. This girl, this slip of a thing he had sold like a piece of cattle, had single-handedly dismantled a gang of the most wanted men in the territory. "You're a clever girl," he said, his voice a low, almost admiring growl. "Cleverer than I gave you credit for." "You didn't give me credit for anything but my price," she countered, her voice like flint. "You taught me a valuable lesson, Reed. Out here, you're either the butcher or the cattle. I just decided I was tired of being the cattle." His hand, which had been hovering near his gun, slowly, deliberately, moved away from the handle. He was a survivor, a pragmatist. He was also a man who knew how to read the odds. He looked into her eyes, and he saw no fear, no hesitation, no flicker of the gentle girl she had once been. He saw only a cold, implacable purpose. He saw a woman who had already died once and had nothing left to lose. He knew that if this came to a gunfight, only one of them would be walking away, and he was no longer certain it would be him. "What do you want, Clara?" he asked, his voice taking on a new, softer tone, the old, familiar voice he had used by the campfire. He was trying to find the girl he had known, the one who had trusted him. "Is it money? I still have the gold. All of it. It's yours. $1,000. More than Thorne was ever offering. You can take it, right away, start a new life." It was his final, most profound miscalculation. He still saw the world in terms of transactions, of debts and payments. He did not, could not, understand the nature of the wound he had inflicted. A bitter, humorless smile touched Clara's lips. "You think this is about money?" she asked, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. "You took more than my freedom, Reed. You took my trust. You took my faith in the idea that there was any decency left in this world. You can't put a price on that, and you can't buy it back." "Then what?" he asked, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. "Vengeance. You'll hang for it. You kill me, and you'll be a wanted woman for the rest of your life." "I've been a wanted woman since the day you saved me," she said. "At least this time, it will be for a crime I actually committed." She raised the pistol slightly, the hammer clicking back with a sound of terrible finality. This was it. The moment she had lived for, the moment that had sustained her through the beatings, the fear, and the long, lonely nights. But as she looked at him, at the man who was now the one who was cornered and afraid, she felt not the hot, satisfying rush of vengeance she had expected, but a cold, hollow emptiness. To kill him now, to simply shoot him down in this dusty arroyo, felt too quick, too easy, too much like the kind of justice he himself would dispense. It was his kind of justice, not hers. Her oath had not just been to make him pay, it had been to make him understand. "I'm not going to kill you, Reed," she said, and the words surprised her as much as they did him. A wave of relief washed over his face. He had misjudged her, but he was alive. "Clara, don't," she commanded, her voice cutting him off. "I'm not going to kill you, but I am going to collect what you owe me." She gestured with her pistol. "Drop the gun belt." Slowly, he hesitated, then did as he was told. The heavy leather rig, with his well-oiled Colt, fell into the dust. "Now the pouch of gold," she ordered. He unslung the heavy leather pouch from his saddle and tossed it to the ground. "And the horse," she said. He looked at her, a dawning horror in his eyes. He understood now. He understood her brand of justice. It was not a bullet. It was the desert. "You can't," he whispered. "You can't just leave me out here. It's a 3-day walk to the nearest water. I'll die." "Yes," she said, her voice as barren and as unforgiving as the landscape around them. "You will. Just like I would have, if you hadn't come along." She swung into her own saddle, never taking her eyes, or her pistol, off him. "You gave me water that day, Reed. You saved my life. And then you sold it. I'm just returning the favor. I'm giving you the same chance you gave me, a fighting chance to prove you're as good a survivor as you think you are." She gathered the reins of his horse and the pouch of gold. She looked down at him, at the man who was now a disarmed, stranded figure, a castaway in the same sea of sin where she had once been. "Goodbye, Reed," she said. "It was just business." She turned and rode away, not looking back. She left him standing there, alone, with nothing but the clothes on his back, the hot sun on his face, and the vast, merciless expanse of the desert stretching out before him. She had not taken his life with a bullet. She had simply taken his horse, his gun, his money, and his hope, and had left him to the slow and partial justice of the thirsting sand. It was a debt paid not in blood, but in dust. Clara rode away from Diablo Canyon with a sense of profound, hollow finality. The fire of her vengeance, which had burned so hot and so bright, had been banked, leaving not the satisfaction she had craved, but a cold, gray ash of emptiness. She had defeated her betrayer, had repaid his cruelty in kind, but the victory felt strangely hollow. The ghost of the girl she had been was not resurrected. The wound of Reed's betrayal was not healed. She had simply become a more efficient, more ruthless survivor. She rode for a week, her path a wide, looping circle, ensuring she was not followed by the remnants of Black Bart's gang or by some miracle of Reed's own survival. She was a ghost on the plains, a solitary figure with 2 horses, a heavy pouch of gold, and no destination. The world, which had once been a place of simple dreams, was now just a vast, empty landscape to be navigated. The gold was a heavy, corrupting weight in her saddlebag. It was the price of her life, the blood money that had been the catalyst for her transformation. Her first instinct was to bury it, to rid herself of its tainted presence. But as she thought of the world she had journeyed through, of the casual cruelty and the suffering she had witnessed, a new idea began to form. The gold could be a curse, or it could be a tool. It could be the price of a soul, or it could be the seed of a new beginning. Her journey eventually led her back to the grim, desperate town in the Wyoming Territory where she had defended the young saloon girl. She rode into the muddy, chaotic settlement, not as a disguised, fleeing boy, but as a woman, her hair now grown out slightly, her posture confident, and her gaze steady. She carried the weight of her history in her eyes, and it gave her an authority that the armed thugs who ran the town seemed to recognize and respect. She went to the saloon, the same place where she had once washed dishes. The cattle baron she had beaten was long gone, having decided the town was no longer a healthy place for him. She found the girl she had helped, a young woman named Lily, still working, her face still bearing the faint traces of old bruises, her eyes holding the weary, defeated look of someone with no hope. Clara took a table and ordered a whiskey. She asked Lily to join her. The girl, shocked and frightened to be seen with a customer, let alone a woman of such quiet, intense presence, hesitated. "It's all right," Clara said, her voice low and steady. "I just want to talk." She slid the heavy pouch of gold onto the table between them. "I came into some money," she said simply, "and I have no use for it. But I think you do." Lily stared at the pouch, then at Clara, her eyes wide with disbelief. I can't take that." "Yes, you can," Clara said. "You can take it, and you can get on the first stagecoach heading east. You can go to a city, buy a small business, a dress shop, a bakery. You can build a life where no man ever lays a hand on you again unless you invite him to." She looked around the grimy, desperate saloon. "Or you can stay here and let this place slowly kill you. The choice is yours." It was the first time Clara had seen a flicker of real hope in the young woman's eyes. "Why?" Lily whispered. "Why are you doing this?" "Because," Clara said, and her voice was filled with a profound, weary sadness, "someone once taught me that out here, you're either the butcher or the cattle. And I'm tired of seeing good people treated like cattle." She left the gold on the table, stood up, and walked out of the saloon without another word. She didn't wait for thanks. It wasn't charity. It was an investment. An investment in the idea that a life, once broken, could be rebuilt. It was an act of defiance against the world that Reed had shown her, an attempt to use the wages of his sin to create a small pocket of grace. She rode out of that town, her saddlebag significantly lighter, but her spirit, for the first time in a very long time, felt a small, almost imperceptible lessening of its burden. The act had not erased her past. It had not healed her wounds. But it had shown her a path forward. She was still a ghost, a wanderer. But now, her wandering had a purpose. She became a legend of a different kind. Not the ghost of redemption, the violent avenger, but a quiet, anonymous benefactor. She would drift into the West's most desperate places, the forgotten towns and the struggling homesteads, and she would find those who were on the brink, the victims of men like Thorne and Reed. She would use the remainder of the gold the ghost's gold, as she thought of it, to tip the scales. She would anonymously pay off a homesteader's mortgage, saving a family from a predatory banker. She would leave a pouch of coins for a widow with too many children and not enough food. She would buy a new horse for a farmer whose old one had broken a leg. They were small acts in a vast and often cruel world, but they were her penance. They were her way of fighting back, not with a gun, but with the one thing that men like Reed and Thorne could never understand, a quiet, stubborn, and anonymous kindness. She was not trying to save the world. She was simply trying to mend a small piece of it, to prove to the ghost of the girl she had once been that a single act of compassion could be a more powerful weapon than 1,000 acts of violence. The trail of a lie had ended, and in its place, she was now blazing a new trail, a quiet path of grace through a world that desperately needed it. The final chapter of Clara's story is not one of a final confrontation or a dramatic end, but of a slow, quiet fading into the fabric of the West she had come to embody. As the years passed and the gold dwindled, her legend became more myth than reality, a collection of disparate, unconfirmed stories told by grateful, bewildered people in the far-flung corners of the territory. She never settled. The ghost of Reed's betrayal was a scar on her soul that prevented her from ever truly trusting again, from ever putting down roots. Her life was one of constant motion, a solitary pilgrimage across a vast and lonely landscape. She was a woman who belonged everywhere and nowhere. Her only home the back of a horse, her only family the strangers she briefly and anonymously helped. The end of her story, as much as it is known, comes from an old, retired lawman, U.S. Marshal who had spent his life chasing the West's most dangerous ghosts. He told the story of a time when he was tracking a particularly vicious outlaw, a man who had left a trail of dead bodies from Colorado to Arizona. The trail led him to a small, isolated, and dying town in the middle of the Badlands. When he arrived, he found the outlaw dead in the middle of the street, a single, clean bullet hole in his chest. The townspeople, a small, terrified collection of poor homesteaders, told him a strange story. They said the outlaw had been terrorizing them for a week. Then, a quiet, solitary woman with short, gray-streaked hair and the coldest, saddest eyes they had ever seen, had ridden into town. She had not said a word. She had simply dismounted, faced the outlaw in the street, and in a duel that was over before it began, had shot him dead. She then tended to a child who had been wounded in the outlaw's previous rampage, using a gentle skill that seemed at odds with the deadly efficiency she had just displayed. And then, before the marshal had arrived, before anyone could even properly thank her, she had mounted her horse and ridden out, disappearing back into the desert from which she had come. The townspeople had no idea who she was. But as she rode away, one of them noticed a single, unique object tied to her saddle, an old, worn, and empty leather gun holster, its tooling a pattern of intertwining serpents. And what of Reed? His fate, too, became the stuff of legend. Some say the desert claimed him, that his bones lie bleaching under the Sonora sun, a fitting end for a man who had worshipped the god of survival and had finally lost his faith. But there is another story, a darker and more persistent one. It is a story of a man who did survive. A man who, through some miracle of will and endurance, managed to walk out of that desert. A creature who was no longer a man at all, but a vessel of pure, vengeful hatred. They say he spent the rest of his life hunting, not for money, but for a ghost. A woman who had taken everything from him and had left him with the one thing he could not endure, his own damnation. They say that, even to this day, if you ride out into the loneliest parts of the desert, on a night when the wind is just right, you can sometimes see them. To solitary, ghostly figures, forever riding the same desolate trails. A woman, always a day ahead, leaving a quiet trail of anonymous kindness in her wake. And a man, always a day behind, following a cold trail of betrayal, forever hunting the woman he had wronged, the two of them locked in a silent, eternal chase across the vast and forgiving landscape of the American West. Their story is not one of love or hate, but of a debt that can never be truly paid, a whisper of a promise, made and broken, that will echo on the wind forever.